Okay, so this is going to be the first lecture that we do in American government. It is certainly not my ideal situation. I would like to, start you out on notes and lecture myself, but unfortunately, time is going to become an issue here. I'm going to be out a few days next week as well, and so I just need to get some notes to you. And so we're going to go through this via video. If you have questions, please write them down as we go, and I will go through them tomorrow when I am back. It is important to me that you get an experience where you can ask me questions and we can have a discussion. So if there's something that you really want to know, just write it down and we'll talk about it tomorrow. So the note sheet, I have a note sheet that I will always give every unit. The sub has those. If you'd like one, grab them. If you want to write in a notebook, that's totally fine. It's up to you. Just a heads up, I collect these before a test and I'll give you points for completing them. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Constitution here. It's important that we sort of understand where we're coming from, and so we start to talk about the Constitution itself as a document. Now, one of the bigger misconceptions in American government is that the Constitution is the first governing document of our country. It is not. We actually have what we call the Articles of Confederation. This was the founding document that was published under the United States when we gained independence after the Revolutionary War. And the essential problem with the Articles of Confederation is that it gave way too much power just to the states. The people who wrote the Articles of Confederation were trying to avoid a system of a king, which they had just come from, and so they gave a lot of power to the states, and that became a problem. And so we start to see this need for kind of a revamp of government within about 10 years. And when we start to think about that, we see a new system arise that's kind of trending at the time, and this is the idea of a federal system. It's a system where power is governed in between a national government and the state government. This is something that makes the United States government unique. It is something that we will talk about very often. It comes up in a lot of other units. It is this idea of how do our governments work together, and what are the benefits of having a state government that's closer to you, that understands the needs and issues of your local people, and a national government that can kind of do these broad-reaching issues that cover the rest of the country. And so we'll talk a lot about that as we go on. One of the other concepts that we need to just get out in the open right away is to figure out how we're going to represent ourselves. And we see two models here, direct democracy and representative democracy. A direct democracy is where each citizen is going to vote on every issue. What does this look like? It looks like you going to the polls every single day. And that can be a problem for a couple of reasons. Number one, nobody has time to go to polls every single day. That's super expensive to send ballots to everyone. And third, which is probably even more important, is that we're not always educated on every single piece of legislation that walks through Congress or goes onto the president's, agenda, or that the, Supreme Court addresses. We can't vote on those things because we aren't experts in all of those fields. And so what we start to see is this, leaning towards a representative democracy, this idea like that why don't we send representatives who can spend time, learn about this legislation, figure out what's going on, and then they can vote in our interests. Representative democracy is always a gamble because you have to hope that the people you send will actually represent you. And we'll talk about that as we go on, especially when we talk about interest groups and things like that. Okay, so we're going to get started in kind of this history part of the Constitutional Convention. It began on May 25th, 1787. 55 delegates head to Philadelphia. Essentially, the idea here is that they're going to go and they're going to edit the Articles of Confederation. They went to this convention not expecting to create an entirely new document. They simply went to go and, change the document that was already there. Rhode Island does not send a delegate. They are very opposed to a strong central government, which they know is going to start to happen, and so they choose not to send a delegate. It becomes very clear very quickly to these delegates that it is very hard to change the Articles of Confederation. It's written in a very, strict way. There's not a lot of wiggle room, and so they decide that they're going to write a new constitution and set up a central government, essentially naming it the Constitutional Convention. What does the Constitutional Convention look like? Well, the delegates all look the same. They are white men, professionals, business people, lawyers. Most of them are pretty young. The oldest is Benjamin Franklin. They all have education. They're all pretty experienced. They, run their own estates. They often have booming businesses. But the thing that we need to take notice of here is that when you put 55 white men who are professionals and young in a room and ask them to develop a government, they're going to walk out of that room with a government that is designed for them. So we can't be surprised that the document they walk out with doesn't have anything about African Americans, doesn't have anything about women, doesn't have anything about Latinos, because those aren't the types of people who are sitting in the room. What we hope is that, as we continue to be diverse and have different needs and ideas, that the people who represent us reflect the diversity of the country. This is certainly not the case in 1787. George Washington is elected to preside over the meeting. He's not elected to become president quite yet. He's just elected to preside over the meeting. And obviously we know that that's going to start to become kind of the stepping stone to getting him into the presidency. Some of the key decisions here that starts to happen, each state would have 2 votes no matter how many delegates they had present. You needed a simple majority in order to pass any new ideas or amendments. Here's a big one. They had to keep things a secret. Please keep in mind that when you put 55 delegates into the city of Philadelphia and you tell them to go and change the governing document of the country, they're actually breaking a law. They are at threat of being indicted for treason, basically overthrowing the government. And so it is a very tense time. It's a very secretive time because these 55 men don't know that this will actually do anything. And if it doesn't, they're looking at some serious, court battles. And so they are very quiet about it. There aren't a lot of written documents about what takes place in the Constitutional Convention. Some of the only documents that we have are some diary entries or letters that they would send home to their wives. What we do know is that they locked all the doors and they shut all the windows, and it is May in Philadelphia, and so it gets very warm. And you've got men in traditional colonial clothes, and so it starts to smell pretty bad. So it kind of gives you a good visualization of what we're talking about here. Okay, so one of the biggest issues, one of the very first issues that comes up right away is how are we going to represent ourselves? We've decided on a representative democracy. Okay, how do we send representatives? How do we determine that? So we have some Virginia delegates who step up during this discussion, and they decide that they would like to introduce an idea of representation based off of population. And so we call this the Virginia Plan. This is the idea that depending on the number of people who live in your state, that should depend on the number of representatives that you have. Obviously, this benefits a state like Virginia, who at the time of the 13 colonies is one of the larger states. However, there are small states that immediately react to this with some serious issues. And so quite quickly we see what we call the New Jersey Plan. This is created by the small states, and it's the idea that each state would have the same number of representatives. Obviously, they don't want to have to, have less of a say simply because their population or their size is lower. And so they believe that each state should have the same number of representatives. So we find ourselves at the very first impasse of the Constitutional Convention. The delegates don't know which one to do. The big states are obviously in favor of the Virginia plan, the small states are in favor of the New Jersey plan, and so we're stuck. So that's going to usher in a pretty important piece here, which we call the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. And this is an agreement that the new Congress would be bicameral or have 2 houses. One house would have equal representatives. We call this the Senate, and one would be based off the population of the state, which is the House of Representatives. So we'll talk about this more when we get into the legislative branch, but in the Senate, we have 2 senators from every state, 100 senators, equal representation. We also have a House of Representatives that's 435 delegates, and those are divvied up among the states after the census or the official population count. Any laws that are passed have to go through both houses of Congress. And so we see that in the House of Representatives, big states have some favorability, but in the Senate, everyone's on the same playing field. And so it kind of evens things out a little bit. So we hit the second problem here, is that the South steps up and says, great, we are planning on counting our slaves as population, and therefore they will have representation in the House of Representatives. Well, obviously the North steps up and says, oh, no, 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 no. It is under our understanding that you consider slaves property, not people. And so you can't go ahead and just count these people if you're not actually treating them as people in your everyday society. And so we find the second large compromise coming out of the Constitutional Convention, and this is the 3/5 compromise. It's the idea that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person in order to determine representation and taxes, and that's where the North gets to win. The South gets to count them as people, but they also have to pay for them as people when it comes to paying money to the government. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about the Electoral College. This is a piece of government that many people are not aware of, and it was set up in the Constitution. It is something that has been around since the founding of our country. The real worry here is that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention are very worried about electing an executive branch or a president when ordinary citizens don't have enough knowledge to vote. Remember, this is colonial times. People are, somewhat differ greatly when it comes to education. There are some people who have, a high school education. Some people are in college. A lot of people have about a 5th grade education because they've, lived in rural areas and they've had to go to work on their family farms. And so the solution here is that each state legislature would choose a number of electors, typically the same, well, now it is by law, the number of representatives you have. So the number of House of representatives you have plus the 2 senators is the number of electors your state has. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Electoral College a little bit later, but really what you need to understand here is that states that have large populations have a lot of electors. And so we see that presidents will go to states like California and Florida and Texas and Ohio and other states like that because they're trying to get those electoral votes. What ends up happening is that they need to have a majority of electoral votes in order to receive the presidency. So this is where it's one of those big misconceptions. People believe that when I go into my voting booth and I check the box for the president that I want or the candidate that I want to become president, I'm voting for them. You're not. In fact, your electors decide who they're voting for based on what their state says. So what I'm actually doing is I'm showing my elector, hey, I'm voting for this person, and I'm hoping that the majority of my state does that as well, and then my electors go to that person. And so it's something that sort of people get frustrated with it. Some people are in favor of it. Some people are against it. Especially nowadays, there's this argument that maybe we don't need it anymore because we have media and we have a lot of educated citizenry. Some people say, it's something that the founders put in place and it has protected us from a lot of big mistakes, potentially. And so it is kind of a piece of debate. Okay, that's the end of the notes for today. Tomorrow we're going to finish up the Constitutional Convention notes. I will be there, and then we'll go on to the Bill of Rights. So jot these down. If you've got any questions, let me know tomorrow. We'll chat about it. Otherwise, tomorrow I'll also post this lecture onto our Canvas so that you could view it again if you needed to. Thanks.